All right. Hello and welcome to our founder conversations. Whoa, is that an actual Starbucks from a Starbucks?
Well, actual Starbucks from Starbucks.
Wow. Tell us what the real world is like, Brad. Anyway, sorry. I'm Sam. I think you know
Green
that.
place, the real world.
Here with Brad, who's one of my favorite people to bullshit about. And this is kind of, Brad, we did a modest conversation way back in the day. These are like the modern video modest conversation updates a few years later. But it's great to
What?
have you back. And I'm excited to riff with you. But I really want to talk about the Starbucks for a second first. So tell us about how you got an actual Starbucks. Was this delivered to you, or did you go to a Starbucks?
I actually walked out onto 24th Street and I went to a Starbucks and I went in and I ordered a coffee.
Wow. And like you saw people, and was
Oh,
there a
people,
commerce going on?
well, things were happening in our ghost town of New York City. There were
Yeah.
people in the streets.
So give us, I mean, like, we obviously want to talk about company stuff, founding and building and the shit we do, but just give us your 30, because it's so amazing and timely this period we're in. You're in actually real New York. Is there anyone there? What is going on? What does it feel like? Like, give us the kind of Corona update.
Yeah, I mean, we spent my wife and kids and I spent the summer in North Carolina, which was awesome. But we came back about a month ago, and honestly, we've been positively surprised at how lively things are. It really feels like, at least in Chelsea, which is where we live, it feels like a pretty normal. It feels like the city we left in a lot of ways.
That's great.
I did go to Midtown, unfortunately, and that's a different story there. And I really do think there's like a critical mass of people on the street that makes things work. You know,
Yeah.
makes businesses open, makes it feel not super weird. And Chelsea is there, and like you cross like 36th Street, and suddenly it's not anymore. So
Interesting.
yeah,
There's like tumbleweeds going through the middle of the city.
it's not a place you want to hang out. I mean, I was picking up some things in our office, which is on 43rd and Madison, and it's weird. You go into an office building, and it's we I think decided on a weekend that we weren't going to be coming back. We weren't going to reopen the office, so it really feels like the world has moved on. There's like real apocalyptic vibes.
Wow.
Went into an old office, and there's not a lot there, and
So you had a beautiful office and you're just done with office. Like, Common is not going back to an office.
we have no timeline for going back to an office. I mean, I'm in an office now. It's my wife had a spot in an empty co-working space a block from where we live, and it's like you. I have two little ones, and it's good to get away sometimes.
Yeah.
If you have to record something on the internet.
For the internet. Yeah, for sure. Interesting. Fascinating. Anyway, so listen, this is all great stuff. It's always great to hear your opinion. I mean, I'd love to kind of unwind for a second. You have founded 3 companies at this point. It depends how you count, I guess. You had your original game. What
Yeah.
was the game called? The Go Cross Campus, right?
Yeah, this was back in college. Started in 2006. Multiplayer gaming company. That was really this idea that we were going to democratize sports through gaming. This is really prior to esports being a thing. And the way to do that was through rivalries, and
Mm-hmm.
that college rivalries, city rivalries, national rivalries are a really powerful thing. And that manifests through sports. But the problem is, you can only have 11 people on a football team on the field at a time. And, certainly if, I'm 6'1" and 145 pounds, so I'm not the person who's going to be on the football team.
Yeah.
Uh, so if you want to manifest those rivalries, it's really hard to do that other than, rooting.
Yeah.
Um, so we built this game as a way for the average person to, have a role. So we basically built these huge games that were turn-based, where everyone had a role to play, and you could have, we would do these things. Our most popular was, we had an Ivy League championship where every person controlled a piece on the map. So we had about 20,000 simultaneous players at one point, which was about about a quarter of the entire Ivy League student population.
Got
We got sponsorships and like, oh, it was fun. Got crushed by the downturn in 2008, however.
Got it. So that one. And why was that? Just because there was no ad dollars.
There were no ad dollars. We frankly, I think we were a little. We should have been. If I had to do it again, I still actually think it's an idea that has some merit. I would have been way more experimental with business model. I mean, obviously, microtransactions, have become a thing since then. I mean, this was even prior to Facebook having a gaming platform. Mobile games were like, Jamdat and ringtones. Like that's where the state of that ecosystem was. There was no iPhone. So it was pretty nascent in terms of business model. You either charged a fixed fee for the game, which didn't make any sense for what we were doing, or you were ad supported. Like those are the two paths.
Yeah. It's amazing how long ago that now feels. But yeah, okay. So GoGo's Company was your first company. Second company was totally different, General Assembly, which started out as early co-working and became a massive education company. Is that a fair way to hyphenate the story?
It started out more as just like a hub, a fun project for tech. I mean, at the time I was, my gaming company had gone under. I was basically unemployed. Doing some consulting projects, met a couple of friends in the, New York tech world. We saw that there were a lot of startups that were hiring for tech talent. They were hiring designers. They were hiring digital marketers. And, there just weren't enough of those people. On the flip side, coming out of the last downturn, there were a lot of underemployed people who were smart, had, gone to good colleges, whatever, but just didn't have the right skills. So we said, let's bridge that gap. And we had
but remind me, just to push you, because I remember, you can tell me I'm wrong with this, but original General Assembly wasn't even an education company. It was literally like, there was the co-working space, right? Or was I wrong? Was there always going to be an education company?
Always going to be education. I don't think we understood quite the degree to which, like, we didn't have the, like, we're going to get people jobs vision. It was more like, hey, we're going to help upskill people. Oh, and we're going to do events. And we're going to have like these cool companies in this space, and it's going to be like the hub and the center of New York tech.
Yeah, which it was for a while. For a while, it really was that when you launched it, which was crazy. When was that? Like 2009, 10?
It was really, it started in 2010, but it was really, I would say, 2011 to 2013. It was a hub of New York tech, and we would do events almost every night. We'd have happy hours every Friday. We would do hackathons on the weekend. We had this huge, giant, like 16,000 square foot space on 20th and Broadway. Back when we got it back when you could lease space on 20th and Broadway for, I think we got it for $27 a foot, which, by the way, you can again today. It started at 29. It went up to like 85, and now it's back down. I don't know. They probably can't give this stuff away these days, but it's back down to 29. Someone should start the next General Assembly. It's
interesting also because you think about like the history of General Assembly, and we'll go to comment in a second and then kind of do a round, like get into questions. But like, there's, in my mind, and maybe I'm miscategorizing this, it felt like when it started, you guys had figured out this like hub model for like a tech community, and like, you were selling seats and memberships and There's like an education component. And then both of those business models, like the education business model and frankly with WeWork, the like co-working model, both took off as like separate things in like big ways. And there was a period when WeWork was on a tear. Then in the back of my head, I was like, man, General Assembly may have chosen the wrong of the two courses, right? In terms of like, although again, it comes right back around where again, obviously with the WeWork implosion, you guys, on the right side of history potentially.
Who the hell like would have looked back in 2011 when we were making that choice and said, you know what? I think we're going to have 9 years of uninterrupted bull market.
Yeah.
Because the reason we didn't go the co-working route is we looked at other co-working spaces, and, they got obliterated in 2008. They got obliterated in 2001. And you've got long-term master lease obligations. You've got fixed CapEx, but very short-term tenancy. And we obviously, and there's secular trends toward that, but how do you take advantage of those secular trends?
Yeah.
Like you can be right that a stock is trash, but you can still lose a fortune shorting that stock if you don't get the timing right.
Totally.
So it's like it just, even though we knew
No,
there was,
look, I'm with you 100%, and that was my assessment too. I mean, even in the early days of WeWork, when I was talking to those guys, and say, no, we're recession proof because in a recession, everyone will downgrade out of their leases into WeWork. And I was like, that doesn't, maybe, right? But there was a period where the world definitely seemed like, there was a collective delusion that was pretty powerful there for a bit, which has obviously come crashing back to earth.
well, it's interesting because I'm actually more bullish on co-working today than I've ever been, because I was on the phone with a large company today, Fortune 500, and we were talking about their future plans for work. And they're like, we're breaking up this concept of like a headquarters. The headquarters is a pretty small collaborative space where people come once a week to meet, to share ideas, to collaborate. They have all their meetings on that day, but most days of the week they are working from home.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily mean home. That might mean a co-working space near where they live. It might
Yeah.
mean a co-working space in their building, which is
Yeah.
something we're trying to figure out right now. And every residential designer and operator is trying to figure out, is like, how the hell do we deal with the fact that like we just got this use case dumped on us, but
Yeah.
we can get there when we get there.
Totally. Well, that kind of leads us to part three, which is your third adventure, right? Which is Common, right? Which you started. How many years old is it now? 4 or 5 years old? More?
We're 5 years old, yeah.
Wow.
5 years
Time
ago.
flies.
Yeah, it does indeed.
And so, and just tell everyone kind of quickly the story there, and kind of time number three around the apple tree.
Yeah, totally. So I left General Assembly in 2015. We sold that business to a Deco Group a couple of years later. It was a great outcome. And really, I've always been obsessed with residential real estate, how it gets built, how it's operated. If you think about the two largest areas of consumer spend, particularly early in our lives, it's education and housing. And we at GA were really able to build a brand on the education side. But housing has seemed to resist brand, technology, consumer experience, a lot of the things we take for granted, and even have hit industries as legacy as finance, where people are doing all sorts of interesting things in the future of banking.
Yep.
To health insurance, but housing, apartments, is still kind of, people are doing it the same way they did it back in the 80s. People are doing construction the same way they did around the turn of the 20th century. Zoning hasn't meaningfully changed since zoning codes became ubiquitous in the 1960s. So there's a lot of things that are still kind of stuck in the prior century, and we're looking at it. We set up Common initially to target a segment of that, which is people who live with roommates. So we started building and operating co-living spaces, and we've since grown and expanded the vision to be a residential operating platform. We partner with owners, developers, people who want to get way more creative with the use of their space, how they think about products, and also how technology is used in and around those spaces. So today we have about 4,000 units under management and about 20,000 under development in 26 cities.
Which is enormous. I mean, I guess it's actually ironically not enormous in the world you're going into, but from a raw numbers perspective and GMV perspective, it's a very big number. Depending on
Resi is so weird. I mean, even if you were to just segment it to multifamily, it's the most fragmented industry I've ever seen. Single largest owner in the world, in the United States. Let's just say the United States, because outside the U.S. it gets really weird. Is MAA, and they own approximately 100,000 apartment units. That's 0.2% of the multifamily market in the U.S. So they're the largest player by far. If you're to expand it to look at management, so who not owns but manages apartments, the largest apartment manager is Greystar. They manage about 600,000 apartment units, so probably a little bit over 1 million people. So more people live in Greystar than live in San Francisco. But most people have never heard of Greystar. And they're still about 1.2% of the market.
Yep.
So it's insanely fragmented, which presents challenges and obviously opportunities.
Yeah. So, I mean, I want to get more into that, but first, just like high level, I just think about you, the arc of your career so far and like what you've done. It's like you've done a friends in college, no capital, social gaming thing, right? You've done a like we're young in New York, meet some friends, build an education company, successful exit, and now you're on to what is a from my perspective at least, and I guess I say this as an early investor and someone who believes in what you're doing, but is like an obvious, like huge capital, long ball game, right? Which is couldn't be more different than a game. Like talk to me a little bit, or talk to everyone about like those different entrepreneurial experiences, kind of some of the lessons you've learned about, when you talk about being an entrepreneur, like the massive differences based on the industry or the life stage or whatever, like, the different experiences you've had.
Yeah, so what is it? Is it Paul Graham who writes about schlep blindness, that idea, and schlep blindness as a competitive mode? That just being willing to do the schlep, the journey, in something incredibly hard can create value in and of itself. And I certainly think the last two businesses, General Assembly and Common, while successful, they're schleps. They're not businesses that anyone looks at and says like, oh yeah, that seems easy. Like the level of admiration and envy I have for entrepreneurs whose businesses look like a server that's plugged into the wall that makes money is just tremendous. But by doing that, you're actually able to affect some real change for people and kind of, I think, create really big levers. So we're excited about the future of Common and the things we'll be able to offer going forward. Things like financial products to our tenants. Ideas like gamifying the experience of renting an apartment is really interesting. Like you earn points by paying rent on time. And you can redeem those points to get all sorts of interesting opportunities, offers, partnerships.
What's the joke that you take long enough, all businesses become finance businesses eventually?
So we're really interested in that angle on multifamily and how basically as a management company, as a brand, we can do way more. So I think and I would say that there was a real journey in building General Assembly that, I think I went from kind of an artistic techie kid who, wanted to do cool things to realizing how by building technology, by building operating structures, building organizations, you can actually effectively do that at scale. I feel like I was certainly a different person in 2015, kind of post General Assembly than in 2010 when I started it with a couple of friends as a fun social experiment in New York City tech.
Yeah, and I guess that's the interesting thing for me is like you talk about schlep businesses now, but General Assembly might have become a schlep business, but it wasn't clearly a schlep business. You didn't start it knowing it was a schlep business.
Oh God, no. But when you look back in hindsight and you're like, oh yeah, we're building a trade school, and we didn't even realize that like what we were building was a trade school for quite a while, like for years. Yeah. We're like, hey, it's something, future of education, ed tech. It wasn't really ed tech. We used a lot of technology, but it wasn't fundamentally a technology company.
Yeah.
And it's real sticks and bricks. Like we're building campuses. We're fortunately rent and CapEx was a pretty small part of our cost structure. So we didn't have a lot of risk there. But it was much more about people, much more about the instructors, about the marketing, the branding, all of that fun stuff.
Yeah. And so it's interesting because then you basically took that experience and said, all right, I'm explicitly going to go start what you knew full well from day one was a schlep business, right? Yeah. Like you were like, I remember you been saying the other day, this is going to take me 30 years to build. And you're like, I'm down for it. I think it's like, and so it's interesting, like what, did you just figure out that you liked the schlep? It's interesting. I think about, sorry to be long-winded for a second and trying to ask a question, but it's like, when I think schlep businesses that ultimately get super interesting, the canonical example is Stripe, right? Where you're just like, payments, oh God, like payment processing is like such a terrible business, right? And those guys kind of schlepped it out. And then kind of, eventually now they're trying to do or beginning to do cooler and cooler stuff, and people are really excited about it. The difference is though that those kids were always the cool kids on the block, even when it was a schlep business, because they were kind of like competing with Braintree and like the YC option for payments and that on like the right timing. I feel like Common was mostly just an obvious schlep business from the beginning, right? Like, and I don't mean this. I mean, obviously excited about it, but like, I kind of wonder, like, how many Brads are there out there? You know what I mean? That are like explicitly from day one going for, I'm going to go climb the super, I'm going to go do the ultra marathon to build a thing, versus in some ways, what I think often it happens a lot in the opposite, which is like the smart kids come out, they think they're building something that's much faster and nimbler, and then it turns into the schlep, and some survive it and some don't.
I feel like you get to it, like, as much as we knew that Common would be a schlep, we also made some very intentional choices through it, which I think made it both bigger and more interesting, but also more of a schlep.
Mm-hmm.
To give you an example, I mean, in the early days, we could have very easily gone a more hospitality direction, more short-term stays, more like brand lifestyle, all of that, which I think could have led to a more fun business and perhaps a quicker win. But instead, we saw this opportunity in more residential property management and said, hey, actually, a lot of the tech that we're building, the way we're doing this, like, there's an opportunity to change the way multifamily buildings are managed overall. Like, let's go after Greystar.
Yeah.
Which is, there's no Y Combinator company out there that's saying, let's go after Greystar. And so that was, it's somewhat craziness. It's somewhat ambition. Mostly craziness, because there's all sorts of moats that those companies have that make them hard targets. So, like, the big institutional property managers, they have vendor relationships
Sure.
because of their scale that let them get cheaper prices on everything from steel to, landscaping. And if you're starting out, you don't necessarily have those things. You have to lean on other things. You have to lean on technology. You have to lean on operating efficiency. Sometimes you have to have expertise that those guys don't. We looked at co-living over time. The co-living focus, it moved from being a standalone product to being a wedge that we had, that we could do. That would win us deals away from the incumbents, and frankly, much more interesting deals than any typical tech upstart could tackle. I mean, so today we're managing 400 unit Class A buildings and
that have a co-living component, or when someone says I need a future of work component or things like that.
At this point, some do, some don't. I mean, some of them are just pure technology plays. Like, we started noticing all these things, like, and you're familiar with this from your days at Finn. Like, you want to handle inbound requests at volume. You want to create a call center, a customer service center, in a secondary or tertiary city, and there's a way to do that and to build that, and you're going to be able to respond to those calls within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever your SLA is. And that's the best way to handle that. That whole concept just doesn't exist in residential. Like, a lead, somebody applies to live at a building, and that lead goes to a leasing agent's desk at the building.
Yeah.
And maybe they'll call them back the next day. And that's just not the best way to do it. Like, you can't deploy technology that way. You can't automate. There are no efficiencies. You can't transfer people between buildings. Like, there's a lot of things. So we said, okay, we're actually going to build that functionality. We'll build the tech for it, since it doesn't exist. And then we're actually going to build the operating structure, since that doesn't exist. And that's a schlep. That takes a while, but once you're at the other end, you have a real moat. And it's in some ways, it's a mutually reinforcing moat, because it's not just a technology moat. It's not just an operational innovation. You have an operational innovation that is paired with the technology, and you can't just knock one of those out.
Yeah, totally. So it's interesting when you talk about this stuff. I mean, this is like real capitalism 101, right? Which is just like, all right, you have like some huge income. Like, what's that?
That's what I'm all about, Sam. Capitalism.
Yeah, capitalism means like, look, yes, like there are way better ways to do things, but certain incumbents grow up in a certain era and make certain assumptions, and like those assumptions are the world changes, there are new opportunities, and you need the Brad Hargreaves of the world to come, right? And just like do the hard work effectively of like stitching those things together. There's a version of what you just talked about, which is you say, I'm going to start the software company and screw it, like we'll just sell the Graystar the technology to do this, or like we'll do that. Plus, oh man, we have to do the operations too because they can't handle the operations. But like, there's some package you could sell. But the other way to do it is to say, no, we're gonna like basically just in-house all this stuff, do the vertical stack, right, and be the next generation. How do you think about as an entrepreneur, like making those choices between like what the slices are that you go after? Like, do you think that someday, I mean, someday some YC company will try to do maybe to compete with you, the call center technology for Graystar, right? Right? Like or something like that. Like the question is like, I don't know. How do you think about those dimensions of what a company is and what to go after?
Great question. It's a great question. So here's what I would say. So everything I've been talking about today is heavy. It's about like you're building systems that integrate with operating infrastructure, and like it just all seems very heavy. But actually, the origins of it are quite light. Which is, if you think just from an MVP perspective, how do you create an MVP that actually adds value and is a better product than the equivalent? One way to do that is you focus on one specific layer and you build that layer better. But that only works if the piece of the value chain below you and the piece of the value chain above you can integrate with that layer in a way that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah.
If you can't, you have to keep taking layers until you get to a place where your innovation can actually plug in to the industry you're trying to fix. Not to get too abstract about it, but in multifamily, in apartments, if the brokerage side is broken, and here's the biggest mistake that I think people make in multifamily, they build a roommate matching app. And the problem with building a roommate matching app is that the experience before and after it are also broken, which is great. You match these roommates up. What do you do then? You're gonna either hook them up with a broker who can show them apartments. Those apartments are not going to be designed with roommates in mind. They're not going to be operated with roommates in mind. Also, the thing that's generating the need is pretty broken to begin with. That people are so broke that they need to live in a living room that's carved out of a 2-bedroom apartment.
That's what I lived. That was my first New York apartment, and my wife's.
People me too. I mean, I lived in a carved out living room of a 1-bedroom in the financial district with a dude named Dario Manarino.
The way they build those walls is pretty impressive, though. Where they just those pressure walls.
Yeah, they just.
Is that a thing that exists anywhere other than New York? The like guy who comes in and builds a wall in one day so you can live in. That is a New York service.
I mean, there's so many things that are just New York specific about construction. It's bizarre. Like the fact that generally New York doesn't use cranes. Like there are obviously cranes in New York, but like in other cities, like 5-story buildings are built using cranes, and in New York, like you would never do that. And that's like labor rules, unions. There are a lot of reasons why that is. The pressurized walls, like the pressurized wall dude, is kind of a New York thing. New York's weird. Tenants paying broker fees, also a New York thing.
Yes, no, I remember that. But sorry, I didn't mean to derail that. So going back to your point, it's like I get your point about the like you have to build to a layer of value or a layer where someone like or there's like a clear ROI that's viable. Is that kind of the other way to think about it? Is like that's something I kind of found in my own. There's a big difference between B2C and B2B, but I kind of came up kind of like you in a B2C world, and I've kind of spent more and more of my time in B2B, which happens. Like that's just what happens when you get old, isn't it? It's like you're just like, man, I'm gonna end up doing more B2B. But like the whole ROI narrative, which is like, all right, your thing is cool, but like I need to buy margin expansion or revenue or profitability in some form, like. A roommate apping app, it's very hard to make that leap from a roommate matching app. It might be less hard from a I can make your service routing better. Although even that seems difficult because no one buys an apartment or not based on like how responsive the service team is, right?
Yeah, it's and you also like you're selling into organizations that have pretty fixed cost structures and fairly rigid contracts with their clients.
Yeah.
And it's actually pretty tough to optimize those from a technology perspective. You kind of have
Yeah.
to rewrite the contract in a way that's better suited to what technology can do. It's like,
Yeah.
you know, you have a way of management and a contract structure that is optimized for what 1980s technology is capable of.
Yeah.
You want to actually get the full value of what 2020s technology is capable of, you have to redo the operating structure and the contract that goes with it.
Yeah. And isn't that, I mean,
that's
that's a lot of why, I mean, you talk about like why the residential market is so messed up. Isn't it kind of come back to a lot of that, which is like, look, you're buying a home, you're leasing an apartment for multiple years. It's not an iterative enough game where a lot of these optimizations at first blush matter. Because you're just like, look, at the end of the day, like I'm spending several $100,000 in a home or whatever. It's like the extra one day of annoyance doesn't really move the needle enough to invest in. So it's like allowed to be lazy, right? Or I'm deploying a gajillion dollars. Like I just, is that like, this happens in like the service world too. Like we're focused on this at Thin, obviously from like a customer service perspective with these teams. Where it's just like until there's a clear ROI story of like how like what you're doing, even if it's way better, actually changes the meta equation, which in your case is like, does someone buy or lease the apartment? It's hard to push.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it's, certainly like any kind of transaction where people do it like once a year, once every other 2 years, it's going to be harder to get innovation and consumer adoption than something like hospitality where, people might travel every week. So
not anymore.
At one point, traveled every week. And that's why, hospitality loyalty programs were such a good idea, such a great innovation. Why Starwood has been able to, build a portfolio of brands.
Yeah.
So it's different in some ways, but that's also where it's important to flip to the B2B side, because even for the customer, the renter is making a decision once every year and a half on average. You have developers and owners that have billions in assets under management, and they're opening a building every 3 months.
Yeah.
So if you can make their lives easier and, provide a better alternative, de-risked alternative to, the guys they've been going out and hiring for the last 20 years, they're quite amenable to that.
Yeah, which basically means just like, I assume, making sure their buildings get rented out faster and then the retention is better. Is that basically what they end up caring about?
Yeah, and there's a lot on the operating expenses side too. That's kind of deep in the weeds. Basically, if you're centralizing a lot of functions, it's cheaper. There are savings.
Yeah.
So there's real operating efficiencies too. But it's interesting. There's a real notion within real estate that you can't innovate on operations. That the only areas you can innovate are acquisitions and tax strategy. And that the operations just are what they are. And one of the biggest barriers to just building a B2B company in real estate is just pushing back on that notion that like, no, there's money being left on the table operationally right now.
For what it's worth, there's a book I'm reading right now, which I don't know if you've ever heard of, but I think knowing you will love, and I think other people maybe listening to this and interested in this type of stuff will love. This is called Memos from the Chairman. Have you ever heard of this?
No.
It's wonderful. It's basically Alan Greenberg, who ran Bear Stearns between the late 70s and like 90s. It's all of his internal memos on culture. And It's really funny because he invents, and they're hilarious memos, but he has this like guru that he invented called like Chaim something something. He's like the sayings of Chaim, and like, it's like one of the great things is around like cost savings, because he's like there are all these great memos being like, look, people only cost cut when like revenue is down. It's like, no, you must be vigilant when the better you're doing, the more your expenses tend to grow, and you must fight expenses. And it's like he has all these recommendations like when you're sending around an internal memo, rather than licking the whole thing and sealing it, lick only half of the envelope so that your secretary can open it. Remember, this is the 70s, 80s, and then the other can be reused by licking the other half of the envelope. Or like he has this whole thing about KPIs around like or performance indicators around how many rubber bands they've saved. And this is again like this is Bear Stearns, right? Like in like while they're just crushing it. So it's like you talk about operating leverage. It's a very funny read.
It's amazing. Yeah, check it out.
You should. You'll love it. Knowing you, you'll particularly love it. Yeah, man. So I guess I don't want to suck too much time. This has been obviously a fun conversation as it always is. But I'm kind of curious. Like I've known you. We've known each other since we were young, and like now we're like what, almost 20 years into our careers ish, getting there.
Yeah.
At least building shit, right?
Yeah.
And building companies. Oh. And like, I'm kind of curious, like if you could unwind, given your now multiple founding experiences, some super successful, some not quite, in totally different environments and different eras, if you could unwind and tell like 20-year-old Brad, maybe with Sam sitting on the roof of Soho House drinking, like some lessons or some things to keep in mind, going out and kind of in the next generation of entrepreneurial journeys, like what are some of the things that you'd want to remind yourself of?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'll just say is like counterfactuals are always hard. I mean, I feel like I'm kind of glad I learned a lot of lessons the hard way. Sort of shaped who I was, and I sort of feel like if someone could go back and tell me to learn those had told me all the lessons, I still would have ended up learning them the hard way, maybe even in more.
Yeah, I certainly feel that way. I feel like I was told all the lessons and decided to go find them out for myself.
Look, I mean, so, I feel like, where areas that I've really, I think probably could have done better is, where I knew that, a strategic change should have happened, where I was going the wrong direction, where something just didn't feel right, and just like act on those feelings. Like, there's so many times like, where even in the first gaming company, it's like, and some combination of like preciousness and sunk cost fallacy is like, no, we're going to keep doing this even though it stopped working. I mean, why didn't we just try microtransactions? I mean, look, I was in my early 20s when I was doing this, but like, why not? Take those shots. And, instead, I think we were a little too married to an old business model. That clearly wasn't working out. So I think I would have, it sounds ridiculous given my entrepreneurial career to say like, I should have taken more risks. I think I should have.
Well, I think it's interesting because just to put it out there, I feel the same way. Like, I think I've made mistakes when like you hold on to things you in your gut feel aren't right. And it's interesting. One part of me is like, that's easy for us to say because we've both, been lucky and worked hard and had good, successful outcomes. And so you look back and you're just like, oh, I could have taken more risk then or whatever. I didn't, you know what I mean? But at the time, I don't know, but for you and me, I think you'd have a lot of people around you saying, no, what you're doing is good. And like, you're building a valuable thing. Like, don't fuck it up. Like there's like a different emotional relationship to it that I think changes with like time and perspective and, ideally success in certain cases, or at least some success. But yeah, I agree. I think one thing when I'm investing in companies, I've always like try to remind it, especially young entrepreneurs of is like, I don't fucking know your business. Like, I have no idea how you're doing. Like, I can try to give you feedback or perspective if you specifically want to do the thing, but like no one's going to know better than you what really has to happen on the ground. And no one's going to be mad if it doesn't work. Like these are all, especially early stage things that like you don't know. So like if you have all the data, your judgment, even if you're young, right, or don't have a lot of experience, is going to be better than anyone else's around the table. Just because like no one else has the data, right, or really feels what's going on.
And it's also hard to put myself back into the place I was back in 2010, 15 years ago. Really until 2013, I was pretty broke. Like until GA got big enough, north of 10 million in revenue. So it's like 2012, we started paying ourselves real salaries. I did not have a steady source of income as an individual, and it scraped by through consulting gigs and all that. So it's, it's obviously challenging to go back and tell that person to take more risks. That's tough.
Fair
So I have
enough.
a lot of empathy for those entrepreneurs.
Totally. Cool, man. Well, I always enjoy our conversations, Brad. I appreciate you doing this. We'll be sharing it around the world of slow and things like that. What any concluding thoughts on checking in? I mean, I hope we'll do another check-in periodically. We'll see how this evolves until we're very old, crotchety men. But like what any other parting thoughts of Brad in 2020 sipping his actual Starbucks coffee? Is it like hot? Like is that a hot coffee?
Actual hot Starbucks coffee.
Wow.
Around 3:30 in the afternoon, I start fading a little bit, and I didn't want to fall asleep on you, Sam. Uh,
I,
so I need my slightly burnt Starbucks coffee. So
yeah,
look,
man.
it's gonna be a crazy next 6 months. Let me tell you, like things are gonna get weird. Things are gonna get really weird. Like start thinking through what it's like, what it looks like for us to start getting anyone back into the office, start building out like working space in our buildings, start like.
Are you
Sam, you there?
actively retrofitting buildings right now? Is that like a major thing for you? Is to figure out? Yeah.
I mean, I think if you're a residential operator now and you're not like very aggressively thinking about how do you build working space into your building, you're just going to be behind the curve. Like, so first thing, just like take the leasing offices, take some of the amenity space, and just like that's working space.
Yeah.
Uh, particularly if you've got a lot of smaller units in the building. So it's just a lot of little things that you got to be doing right now to stay ahead of the curve. And it's going to get really super weird when we start rolling out a vaccine. I mean, even vaccine bull, vaccine bear. I mean, it's going to happen at some point, probably in the next 12 to 18 months, and like that's going to be very, very strange.
Yeah.
Um, we have employees who are excited to take the vaccine, and myself included. I feel pretty good about it. We have others who are like, hell no, like I'm not touching that. How do we think about interactions between those people
Yeah.
and what they're able to do in the workplace?
Totally.
Questions that there's no precedent for them. How do
Yeah.
we think about managing that in a housing environment?
Yeah. Yeah. You're gonna have whole buildings of vaxxers and anti-corona vaxxers.
And there's a poll that came out the other day, and it was it asked New Yorkers, are they willing to take a vaccine? And it was 45-44 yes, which is pretty even split.
Yep.
And not many polls of New Yorkers are even splits. And
Right.
so
And that's New York, which is, you look nationally, that says something where what the actual numbers will end up being.
It's going to get really weird.
Yeah. It's going to get super weird and it'll be interesting. So just, I guess in closing, because I am curious, your plan is to reopen a central office and have some mix of employees in there consistently per usual, like back in the day.
Yeah, we're going to be much more open with work from home and even permanently remote work. But we have a sizable contingent of employees, I would say a majority, who want to go back into the office on some cadence. Particularly the more junior, generally the more junior, the more willing they are, the more excited they are to go back. It's not 5 days a week, but like 2 or 3 days a week.
It's just interesting. I think there's another thing where there's going to be huge cultural divides even by cities. Like I feel like in San Francisco, the default feeling, and this is just from talking to people, is people are just like, the offices are not coming back. I mean, there'll be, to your point, like meeting once a week type things and spaces, but like normal office work will not ever come back. I feel like other parts of the country were like, yep, we're immediately back. We want to be immediately back at work. I think New York is probably, ironically, somewhere in the middle, right?
Yeah,
like,
I agree with that.
but it's going to be super regional how people respond to this, which is going to be fascinating and probably shift a lot of things.
Yeah, I think we hear it, the pro office side, a lot from more junior employees who are frankly the ones who I believe suffer the most from not having an office environment. They don't get the mentorship. They often have really shitty work from home setups too. I mean, if you're living with mates or you're in a studio, it's like that's brutal. Yeah. So we have a sizable contingent that really want to get back.
Yeah, I believe 100%.
So it's going to be, once again, it's going to be really weird.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of the hybrid where like some people are in, some people are out. I think that sucks.
Yeah.
At least now everyone's on conference calls.
Yeah,
And
it's all equal. I mean, this is kind of yeah. This is a whole second and third conversation to have about like symmetry and asymmetry in work environments. It's like in you know how kind of Corona forcing everyone home unlocked remoteness in an interesting way, largely because it just used to be such a huge disadvantage to be remote, and now it's not, obviously. But anyway, let's pause it there because that's a whole other topic for another day. But Brad, it's always great to talk to you and catch up. I appreciate the insight and perspective, and I'm glad things are going well. And I look forward to seeing your retrofitted buildings and the marketing that goes along with them, that hugely powerful internet and conference rooms.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for
Talk to you, dude. Peace.